All right, here's part 2 of the South, guys. We'll get this done. I'm actually going to hurry. I've got to get to my grad class, my principal school class, so we'll get this done in a hurry. Let's go ahead and play the slideshow. All right, so again with education, again, the South much more dispersed, much more spread out than the North. All right, race, overall, and that's actually the figure is incorrect from the book. It's 32% enslaved African American, but 34% African American. Someone said in class it's about a third of the Southern population was African American. The rest were pretty much Caucasian. You might have had some people that had, some obviously some American Indians and things like that, but most of Southern society was really dominated by Caucasians. All right, and obviously slavery plays a huge role. On the right-hand side, you see state by state. This would be some really good data for projects. You can see some states had very few African American slaves. Maybe 10%, or just overall. See, Delaware had 17% free blacks and 2% slaves. So they were a slave state, but only 2% of the population was slave. And all the way down the bottom, you see South Carolina, Mississippi have majorities, African American majorities. So these were African American. These were black states. All right. So that's kind of shocking sometimes to people to see those numbers. All right, religion, largely Protestant, not many Catholics down here. We'll talk about again with that's directly related to the lack of immigration. The Christian faith caught on with slaves, and it was taught to slaves. A lot of times we'll talk about slaves weren't taught to read and write, but they were definitely taught religion. It helped kind of soothe them after long days in the field and kind of reassure them. Again, they really liked the idea of salvation and that there was life after this because their lives were so bad. There's also a lot of talk in the Old Testament of the Bible about slavery. And so the whites would use religion to talk about, well, slavery is a part of life. They had it in the Bible, so it must be okay. And they do this right up into the Civil War. Whereas African Americans use the example of the Israelites in the Old Testament to really kind of, they find solace in the fact that these people, these holy people, had been enslaved. Like Moses leads them out of slavery and so on in the book of Exodus. And they sing a lot of the spiritual songs they sing, like "Swing Low, Sweet Chariot," were about kind of deliverance out of slavery, just like in the Bible. So both whites and blacks had reasons beyond just being Christian, right, to be Christian. All right, immigration, very little immigration from Europe or other parts of the world. And there's a reason for that we'll talk about in just a second. Any immigration was largely from the Atlantic slave trade. And actually, the slave trade was outlawed in America in 1807. There was still the internal slave trade because you could sell a slave from Virginia to Mississippi or vice versa or wherever. But it was illegal to bring slaves in from other countries in Africa. That didn't mean that it didn't still happen. So some people still smuggled slaves in. I think the last recorded slave ship that was smuggled into the southern United States was in 1859, right before the Civil War. The other thing about this was, think about this, why would there be very few immigrants? If you're coming as a German or an Irish immigrant to America, you're looking for work, you're looking for those low-paying jobs to kind of get a foothold, and you're competing. You go to the South, you're competing with slave labor. And as I was telling kids in class, that you can't compete with free. So if you wanted a wage, you had to go to the North. And the other reason why the North was so attractive for immigrants was because the cities, remember, they're acting kind of as a vacuum, these factories, sucking people in from the countryside, but also from Europe and other parts of the world. So the Irish and Germans would often come and work in the factories. Last one here today, guys, about social class. It's a really good social pyramid from your book, similar to what we learned about last year with ancient Egypt and China and so on. The top, that 8%, they have 5 or more slaves. That's going to be kind of that planter class. They live on these large, stately plantations, these huge kind of farm complexes. And that's a lot of our founding fathers: George Washington, James Madison, Thomas Jefferson. They were all these kind of planter class. Down below, some people, you might have been a shop owner and owned a couple of slaves, things like that. Some middle-class whites owned slaves. I say employed, but I should say owned. Then you have down there, this is on the right, 50% whites who own no slaves. A couple different classes here. One would be these kind of yeoman farmers who really supported themselves, lived in kind of the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains, Tennessee, northern Georgia, West Virginia. And also we had kind of poor whites who barely kind of got by, maybe didn't even own land, maybe rented from land from rich farmers or landholders. And then lastly, you have free African Americans. And then finally, I don't include it there on the left, but obviously 32% of the population were the enslaved African Americans, and they're on the bottom of the pyramid. Thanks for viewing.